Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Beyond the Classroom, Sales Training at a Tipping Point. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping points. We are using the GoToWebinar platform for today's presentation. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode for the duration of the session. We will be holding a Q&A later, so if you do have any questions during the webinar, you can use the question panel, which is within the GoToWebinar application, and we'll answer as many of those questions as possible at the end of the session. The recording of today's webinar will be made available approximately 48 hours after today's session and sent out to the email address you used to register. So, without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker. We're delighted to be joined by Tim Riesterer, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions. Tim is a marketing and sales industry veteran and has more than 20 years of experience. And he's dedicated his career to improving the conversations that marketeers and salespeople have with prospects and customers. His books, entitled Customer Message Management, Conversations That Win the Complex Sale, and 3 Value Conversations, focus on improving market-ready messages and tools that marketeers and salespeople can use to win more deals. As Chief Strategy and Research Officer for Corporate Vision, he sets the direction and develops the products for this leading marketing and sales, messaging, content, and training company. So Tim, it's over to you to explain why sales training is close to a tipping point.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to Showpad for this opportunity today. And as I think about this idea of a tipping point, there's always a question about when something is going to become sort of the next big thing. And in sales training, there's been rumors of what I'm going to talk about today for, I would say, almost 20 years. And the question is it now becoming mainstream, maybe because of a generational change in the workforce or technological advances in the platforms, and we'll talk about that today. But first I want to give you some background and some research that just happened where our company partnered with 2 magazines, the same publisher, Training Magazine and Sales and Marketing Management Magazine. And we interviewed 278 companies and asked them some questions about their sales training and development, in particular the area of sales skills training. And what we identified is that 4 out of 5 companies believe that their salespeople don't get the sales training, specifically skills training, they need each year. So that means that 80% of companies are dissatisfied that their training is reaching as many of their people as they need to be. So there's a struggle to get people trained, as many of them as often as they believe. One of the things that they identified was that the number one constraint, the number one reason this isn't happening is 56% of them say that time out of the field, the pressure to keep people selling in the field, not taking them out and putting them in the classroom, is the number one reason they're not training as many people as they need to. In fact, budget came in second, but 20 percentage points behind field constraints. We then ask, who's likely to make the decision? Who's likely to choose the training for a salesperson? And it was identified that managers are the ones who typically will identify which salespeople go to training and often which training they take and when they take it. But I think that's kind of an interesting challenge because more than likely it's the manager who doesn't want their salesperson to spend any time in the classroom. They need them in the field hitting their number. So we think that that's a bit of a reason that the time out of field pressure has become the greatest constraint, is that the person who's making the decisions has the conflict of interest by keeping people in the field. We asked them then where they're going to spend money. So these 278 companies, 65% of them said we are going to increase significantly or somewhat our investment in virtual training. When it comes to traditional classroom training for skills, the investment there is flat. There's no growth in that area. So clearly now we're starting to see that the virtual training environment or option is becoming the place where most investment is going now. Not in terms of the grand total or amount of investment, but the increase in investment. So that begged us to ask one more question. So which mode or which model of training do you think is most effective? And we thought this was very, very interesting. In fact, 90% of the companies believe that some form of in-person training, whether it's the instructor-led classroom or managers leading application or in-person work and coaching and training with their salespeople, only 10% thought that virtual online training was the most effective when it comes to changing behaviors. So the irony there is that while most people are increasing their investment in virtual training, the vast majority don't believe it's the most effective. So that really creates a question in our mind that I want to talk about today. For sales training to be at a tipping point where maybe the majority of the time spent on training moves out of the classroom and out of the field and into a virtual environment, it has to do more than just increase the efficiency of training and reach more people. For it to really grab hold, it has to improve the effectiveness of the training. One of the things we heard in the survey was from the people who said they had gone to virtual training is they said, quote, "We trained more people on 14% less budget." But if that becomes the objective of training, being able to reach more people on less budget, the business impact could suffer. So what would it take for that same person to say, we moved from classroom to virtual and we still increased sales performance by 14%? And that's what I want to share with you today. Some ideas that will create a true tipping point in sales training to move beyond the classroom to incorporate virtual in a more significant way. So the question is, how can you do both? Increase efficiency and effectiveness by moving into the virtual world, which many people are skeptical of. So the first thing I want to share is this idea of turning your training programs into a story and identifying a proven set of core competencies. One of the things we see when we work with companies is that much of their training is just a collection of different skills programs that have either been developed in-house or purchased outside. And these skills programs have names to them and they have some objectives, but they're just a collection, a loose collection at that. What we're recommending moving forward is that first, even before you take the step of virtualizing, you have to tell a learning story. And this pertains even to this idea of the millennials and what will capture their interest. The truth is, all people live in a story. And your training actually needs to appeal to the story that people live in. So one of the ideas we're recommending is consider organizing your collection of skills training into a story that tells the learner why it's important for them and what they will get out of the learning. So instead of being a loose collection of programs, what if you could identify the reasons they exist? So one idea I want to give you today, and we captured this in our book called The 3 Value Conversations, is help your salespeople see themselves as needing to master value-based conversations across the buying cycle or sales cycle, and help them see that these value conversations have moments of truth where they must be great, and that to be successful in their career as well as be successful in their contributions to your company, here's an opportunity for you to learn in a way that helps you master your craft. But not master your craft based on a loose collection of programs, but master your craft based on the outcomes you want to achieve. Great salespeople build tremendous amounts of qualified pipeline. That means they learn and master the skills of creating value by disrupting their prospect status quo and differentiating from the competition. Great salespeople master the idea of building proposals that are agreeable to executive and financial decision makers. We call that elevating value. They must be able to justify a budget by building a business case that executive deciders agree is valid. And great salespeople must maintain your margins and your pricing in order to drive profitable deals. And they do that by capturing value, not letting it leak out, and expanding the size of the deals and making sure they're not discounting excessively. The first idea for salespeople in this new modern age is to tell them a story of learning, not just show them a collection or a catalog or a curriculum of a loose affiliation between a bunch of programs. Help them see why this is important to their personal development as well as their contribution to the company. So that's the first step I wanted to share with you today. The idea then is make sure that you can identify very specific competencies within each of these areas. Right now I'm just showing you some examples of things that we've identified and developed as proven competencies that if a salesperson learns these specific skills and becomes competent to them, they can achieve mastery of this particular part of the story. And each part of your story then should be associated with or linked to key competencies that a salesperson must learn, practice, and demonstrate some proficiency in. Your program will have greater success if you can identify the story of and what must be mastered, but also detail the competencies that a salesperson must learn, must test, and must demonstrate some proficiency. So I'm not showing you these so you can take notes real quick, and of course we'll send out the slides, but the vision I want you to have is that at some point you have identified a competency map for your salespeople that roll up to the learning story that they're now hoping to achieve and hoping to master. But ultimately what this competency map allows you to do is starts to help you to identify the library of virtual content that needs to be created in your organization. So for virtual learning to reach a tipping point and move from just being an efficient alternative and now becoming an effective replacement, you need to identify a learning story, determine the competency map, and then now you've got the modules that you should be creating or turning into virtual content and building a library to work from. So what I need to do for the rest of this presentation is assume there's a virtual library in place that's been built to train to competencies. So what I'd like you to imagine is that each of these competencies has a 10 to 15 minute virtual video module attached to it. And that within that virtual module, there's teaching of the concept, there's examples of good and bad, there's practices and quizzing, as well as application. So imagine that each of these modules has 10 to 15 minutes of content, and of course, all the adult learning principles included. And that assumption is prerequisite to explaining the next four ideas, because the big problem we believe with virtual training today, for those of you who have tried it over the last 10, 15 years, is that it is not identified as helping salespeople based on what needs they have. It's very arbitrary and generic. And the first lesson that I want to convey is that the adult learner learns most effectively not when somebody arbitrarily decides they need to learn, but when the adult learner finds themselves in a deficit. And in fact, you and I, we learn best when we are in a deficit. The other day, a light went on in my automobile, and I saw that light, but I did not remember what that light meant, because I didn't study the owner's manual when I bought the car, and I didn't listen very well when the automobile dealer told me what everything meant. I had to, at that moment, go find my operator's manual, dig through it, and when I couldn't find it, I just Googled the question, and I found the answer. What that makes me, and what that makes you, is a just-in-time, situation-specific learner. We actually learn best in the moment we need to learn, and we only like to learn as much as we need for that situation. Once again, I only figured out what I needed for that situation and in that moment. And guess what? Your salespeople are adult learners just like you and I. They learn best when they are in deficit and need something, not when we schedule them for a class. And the next ideas I want to give you, very importantly, recognize this fact that the idea of creating learning paths for salespeople, where it's based on the tenure of the salesperson, how long they've been at your company, or the role they have in your company. Just because of their title, people have been creating learning paths that in reality, the biggest barrier to effective learning isn't necessarily whether or not you have virtual or classroom. In fact, the biggest barrier to learning is that it doesn't meet the salesperson in their moment of need, when and where they need it, with the learning they need for the situation they're in. And that's because it's been classroom-based, scheduled on a calendar, potentially 6 months out, and then it gets canceled because travel budgets have been frozen. So it's an arbitrary decision set for an arbitrary date that then is sometimes arbitrarily dismissed because of an arbitrary travel budget freeze. So what I'm going to propose are 4 ideas that your company can consider to create custom learning paths for your salespeople, with the assumption that you've got a library of virtual content. I know that seems like a big deal, that you need that first, but my point is that people need to figure out how to, if they build a library, make it one that is effective. So these ideas will help you with that. The first is that you need to look at the idea of performance-based custom learning paths, and not this idea of arbitrary learning paths. What do I mean by performance-based? The advent of big data is allowing you to totally rethink what training you give to salespeople. Instead of having it by role or title and by tenure in the organization, you now know things because of big data. The data and analytics provided by your CRM system, or the data and analytics provided by your ShowPad platform, will tell you certain things. You should be able now to identify your salespeople who are struggling to create pipeline or create enough opportunities or create enough business to hit their quota. The data is there. You can go into a CRM system today and look at everybody's pipeline, and you can know and identify a group of salespeople who will not hit their quota if they continue to develop pipeline at the rate they're building it. You can also discover in your CRM system the salespeople who have the most number of deals getting stalled right in the middle of the sales process. You see their deals bunching up, and I say their pipeline getting constipated at a certain point in the middle where they got a bunch of proposals out, but nothing seems to be getting signed, nothing seems to be coming in. Things seem to be getting stalled and ending up like stuck in no decision. You can identify those people because the data can show you that if you just printed out a pipeline or a pipeline report. You can also tell from your data today which reps are struggling to have profitable deals. You have enough data at your disposal that says, hey, so-and-so, this group of people seem to be discounting more than everybody else and have the least profitable deals. The advent of big data is putting you in a position of not just arbitrarily assigning training, but actually assigning training based on performance indicators where salespeople are struggling. So what I want you to imagine is if you now had a virtual library of training and now you had access to big data, you could group those people into the areas where performance would indicate they have needs for training. So instead of it being based on their tenure with your company and the role they have, you're actually going to push them some training based on where the data shows performance is lagging. And you can start to actually package up and push to them knowing this performance struggle, and thereby improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of your virtual training, leveraging big data. The data's there. You can find it in reports. If you have virtual content, now you can take and organize it and push it to people based on known competency struggles and identified performance indicators where they're lagging. That's one big idea we have for you to improve the effectiveness of virtual training. Make it performance driven and package it and push it to them when you identify that need. Don't wait for them to sign up for a class and hope that class actually happens. What good is a class 6 months from now if I'm struggling with pipeline today? Send them some content today. So performance-based custom learning paths. We've also identified the opportunity for needs-based custom learning paths. Some of you may be familiar with and using some sort of an assessment already. But one of the things that you can do when you have virtual content is consider the idea that you can respond to needs assessment with virtual training just in time. So today, a needs assessment might be used by some organizations to identify where some salespeople are or aren't lagging in competencies. Not every company does this. Like I said, most do arbitrary learning paths where it's role and tenure. But we've identified and developed a fluency assessment, and it's identified against those 3 moments of truth: the ability to create pipe, the skill and ability to build proposals that pass muster with the executive decider, and the ability to run profitable deals. And being able to assess that against a benchmark or a baseline, and identifying which areas of these 3 value conversations you're stronger or weaker than high performers. And then literally being able to identify down to the competency level which things you need to learn. So imagine tomorrow, instead of deciding you should go take this class because you've been with our company 1 year now, you say you should take this class, or you should learn these 5 modules because based on the needs assessment, the outcomes-based needs assessment, this is where you appear to be weakest relative to high performers. That will change the game in terms of how you train your salespeople. It's not arbitrary. It's not even performance-based. It's now needs-based. You can proactively get ahead of things instead of waiting for the performance indicators to go red. You, ahead of time, identify the potential gaps and then begin to push, package up and push to that salesperson the right kinds of training for the gaps or deficiencies that have been identified in their own personal needs assessment. The future of sales training and sales training effectiveness is going to be proactively identifying the fluency and skills of your salespeople in the key areas they must perform, and be able to package up and present to them training just in time when you identify that need, not waiting again for a catalog, a class to be scheduled, and the risk of it being postponed or pushed. So number 1, performance-based learning indicators using big data to then package and push virtual content to your sales rep will help improve not just the efficiency but the effectiveness of virtual training. Number 2, needs-based assessments that proactively identify the kinds of behaviors that are missing or the kinds of gaps in the skills that the salesperson has, so you can intervene with virtual content and virtual training before their performance starts to lag, is a second idea. The third idea for the just-in-time learner is the idea of actually presenting training in a what I call a situationally relevant way. So what does that mean? So one of the things I've seen inside of companies when it comes to training models is that there are really, in addition to selling skills training on the bottom right here, there are other core sorts of training that have to happen. Product training or solutions training, guess what? It has to happen. People have to have some level of proficient knowledge of products and solution training. Often companies are teaching to vertical markets or industries and targeting to teach domain expertise or market expertise so that you can relate to the customer. And often there's sales process training because everyone in the company has to have a demonstrated level of proficiency with the process so that you can manage your salespeople and your pipeline accordingly. And often sales skills training on the bottom here gets sort of the short end of the stick, as we like to say. So one of the ideas that we've identified, sorry, got to go the right direction. One of the ideas we've identified is this idea of what if skills training wasn't left as its own thing that maybe your company got to? What if you could actually embed the skills training? What if you could incorporate skills training into these other very necessary activities? And one of these ideas we have is this idea of embedding your sales skills training into your sales process and reinforcing your sales process. What do I mean by that? So remember what I said. Salespeople are just-in-time, situational specific learners. One area where they might be ready to learn, and one area where it's easier to learn, is if you can integrate and embed your skills training right into their sales process and right into their daily workflow. So I've got an example of Salesforce.com here, or maybe it's inside of your ShowPad application where you've got your salespeople going to get relevant content to support certain stages of the buying cycle. So in this case, let's just say somebody's in an opportunity, they're at stage 1 to generate demand. Imagine a day tomorrow where not only can they get relevant content on your solutions and products in stage 1 and the kinds of content you've built for generating demand, what if they could get their training there as well? What I'm saying and what I'm recommending is embedding skills training into a day in the life of the salesperson, so that now that you've got these virtual modules, those virtual modules would be present, they would appear right in the workflow, and they would be situationally organized so the right modules would show up for the right activity the salesperson is performing that day or in that moment. So if they're in stage 1 on your CRM or in your ShowPad, you would have the virtual training modules there to help them learn some concepts in that stage, because that's the moment they're going to be most interested and then frankly most needy in terms of wanting the training. If they go to another stage, stage 4 let's say, and now they're in the presenting and proposing stage, you present content to them for your solutions at that stage, but why not the skills training? Why does skills training always have to be such an outlier, such a remote thing that maybe does or doesn't happen, and it does or doesn't get on the calendar and exists in its own little world in this catalog? Why can't it exist in the experience of the salesperson day in and day out, having virtual modular content that is relevant to the selling situation they're in, puts learners in a position of being able to access it when they're in the very deficit where they need the help? So that's another one of the big ideas. So first idea, performance indicators using big data gives you the opportunity to push the right training at the right time for someone based on those performance indicators, thereby improving the effectiveness of virtual training. The second we talked about was needs-based, doing an assessment to proactively identify the gaps, push them virtual content at that moment that you identify it, and begin to train them ahead of the performance indicators. The third idea for improving the use and efficiencies and effectiveness of virtual training is embedding it inside of your sales process and the actual day in the life experience of the salesperson, so they can learn when they need it as opposed to an arbitrary event. The fourth and final idea that we've got for you to improve the experience and efficiency, but most importantly, the effectiveness of virtual training, is something we're calling sales play specific custom learning path. Sales play specific learning path. Here's one of the trends that we're starting to see is that companies are creating lots of content to train salespeople on products and solutions or on vertical markets. Why not move the skills training into that kind of training instead of, again, keeping it separate? Here's the big idea for that. So imagine you're launching a major disruptive product, and you've built some messaging and some content, and you've got it on ShowPad, and it's available on your mobile app. So it's interesting that you would present the messaging and some of the content to help the salesperson in that major disruptive product announcement. But it might be really powerful if you think about embedding skills training along with that messaging and content. If you have a library of modular content, and those modules are attached to specific competencies that a salesperson needs, can you imagine a day where you'd go into that library, pick some of those modules out that are the most relevant to the particular product announcement or vertical market campaign that you're running? So when you launch a message and some content, some campaign content and sales enablement content, you would embed the appropriate skills training modules along with it. Why? Because again, the salesperson at that moment is now willing to learn. They're thinking, wow, I have to launch a major disruptive product to the market. And yes, I have my promotional campaigns and yes, I have my promotional sales literature, but that doesn't mean I have the skills to be disruptive. And so imagine having situational virtual modules embedded into your sales play so that you have the skills to complement the stories that you've built. Because without the skills, the story may not be adopted. Salespeople may feel very uncomfortable telling that story. They don't feel they really have the skills associated with that. Imagine that you're doing a different sales play or a different launch, and this time it's for a new bundled set of products that create a complex integrated solution. It's an effort to package up your various point products into a solution because you want to sell solutions, not products. And it's complex, and that requires the sales cycle to go to more senior levels. It requires more consensus, more buyers, influencers in the process. That's not just a recipe for a new story or new messaging and content. It also might require new skills. So again, think of this idea that situationally, you would identify and embed the skills training virtual modules into your sales play so that not only did your sales rep get the new messages and the new content for this complex integrated solution announcement, but they maybe got specific skills training designed to help them sell a more complex solution, help them to manage a more complex selling process, and increase their ability to speak to executive buyers because now the price tag went up. Situational skills training presented inside the context of a sales play, not as some separate catalog and calendared item for the salesperson. Finally, even if you're launching a sales play on a commoditized product, but you think you have to demonstrate differentiation and you want to protect your pricing in a highly competitive market, you build some messages and content, but lo and behold, in your library, there are certain modules that are really designed and really helpful in certain parts of selling that salesperson needs to become proficient on in order to successfully execute that sales play. So the premise here is that if you're running a sales play or launching a new product, your messaging and content is a good story, but do your salespeople have the skills to tell that story as well as it should be? And the truth is they might not, or they could at least use some reinforcement. And why not embed the skills training into the product solution or market sales play that you're running in order to improve the usefulness and the effectiveness of sales skills training? So in a nutshell, what I've told you today is that virtual sales training is a reality because time out of the field is a constraint. But most virtual sales training is based on the efficiency principle. I can deploy it more quickly and efficiently and lower cost to more people. But that doesn't move the needle on performance. You have to improve effectiveness. And I've given you several ideas for that. Specifically, if you have virtual content, first identify from big data where salespeople's performance is lagging, package up the relevant virtual content for that area where they're struggling, and push it to them and engage them with virtual content based on what the performance indicators say. Maybe even more importantly, get ahead of that problem and not wait for a performance indicator, which is lagging. Identify the gaps by running an assessment and determining where your salespeople are and aren't fluent across the buying journey or the sales process, and then identify and configure your virtual content for which need or which gap they have and push that out to them. Or consider putting your sales training into a day in the life scenario, presenting the appropriate training at the appropriate moment in your sales process and serving it up through the technology you've chosen to support your sales reps with. Or the fourth idea is, as you launch a new story or sales play, connect the skills training to the story. The story may be great, but if salespeople don't have the skills to tell that story right, your story may not get adopted by the salespeople or may not get delivered appropriately. So combining sales skills with the stories creates a more powerful and effective way of ramping up your salespeople on something new. So there you have it, a quick spin that says sales training beyond the classroom in the virtual environment is possibly at a tipping point because all the new technologies, the big data, and other ideas we shared can take virtual training from just being an efficient idea to a more effective idea. And once sales skills training in the virtual mode becomes more effective because of some of these ideas, we definitely will see a cascading tipping point where no longer is a salesperson waiting 6 months to get into a class that may or may not get canceled and having to struggle until they get that training. They're getting training when, where, and how they need it. And that presents a whole new opportunity to increase the effectiveness. So I appreciate your time today. We're going to take some questions now, Emma. But if you see this link here, remember that it is case sensitive. I've documented much of what we talked about today in an ebook that you can order from us, the research and the ideas. And of course, the recording will be available as well. So Emma, thank you for this opportunity. I'll take some questions now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. An absolutely fantastic and insightful presentation this afternoon. So it looks like we have a couple of questions come in. So just to let everyone know, you can use the question panel on this GoToWebinar section and just type your question in. We've had in so far. Can you talk about how these approaches might be more relevant for millennials in the workforce versus other generations, something that's at the forefront at the moment?
Yeah, everybody wants to know about how to reach the millennial, what's going to be different because of the millennial. And I think some of that can be a little overstated. But I will say that I do believe that part of the tipping point is that we're going to get a generation of people here who have grown up with the technology. And I know that probably sounds overstated and cliche, but there's a lot of truth to the matter that devices and technology and doing their banking, everything from banking to shopping to everything else they do, the anticipation or the natural move, there's now a natural bent instead of an unnatural bent to doing that on your device. And so I can see that part of the tipping point will be that the generation of workers coming up have a much higher expectation and a much higher comfort level that they will learn on demand, because this is how when I need it, I want it. When I want it, I need it. And I want it where I need it. And so training has got to reconcile itself with that generational shift. But the other thing, as I talked about earlier, is I find millennials tend to live in a story and have an anticipation that what they're doing is having impact. And so the problem with arbitrary learning paths where it's based on your role and based on your tenure is it's sort of just like, take this training because. And so the opportunity is to tell a better story to millennials. Look, we've organized your training based on mastering your skill and your craft, and as a result, you succeeding. So this is what it looks like. Here's what the buying cycle looks like. Here's what the outcomes are that you need to achieve and how you will have impact. We've organized your skills training to help you achieve those outcomes, to have that impact. Oh, and by the way, we can serve it up in a way that's more desirable. Millennials live in a story, and a story that says, I'm having impact and purpose in everything that's done. And I think the problem with much of our learning today is it's pretty arbitrary. It's in a catalog. Your manager might pick it, or, hey, you've been here 90 days, you get this. You've been here a year, now you get that, with no regard for whether or not they actually need it. You know, there's no sense of, does your performance indicate you need this? Does your assessment indicate you need this? So we think that this idea of building a story around your training that demonstrates the impact for them and the impact they can have, and then serving it up in the way that matches their generational tendencies is going to be a way to address millennials. But the fact that millennials exist might be part of this tipping point in the first place.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Tim. We've got two questions now that are quite related. So the first one is, do you think it's important to get people into an actual classroom environment where they can then role play and get coaching and feedback? And the second one, which is linked, is what about the role of practice to really embed these new skills?
So what you're going to get from me, a guy who's been in this business for decades, who's not a millennial, is absolutely, and I'm a student of the adult learner, right? I mean, this is where I do my research. If you want to learn a skill that teaches you how to have a better conversation to, let's say, protect margins, you can't watch a video and take a quiz. I just believe that. You can't raise your hand and say, I got a badge and I quizzed out of that test, but never have moved your lips in front of a customer or practiced with a manager. So here's the deal. I think what's going to be shifting when it comes to the classroom is the classroom experience will be shorter and it'll be focused. So what's happening in the classroom now is so much of the classroom time is taken up teaching the concepts. And actually, very low percentage of classroom training is in the role play, practice, application, coaching, and feedback. What I see happening is more focus on application, practice, role play, feedback, coaching, and shorter practice, half day, 1 day, maybe even multiple online versions, not 2 days in a classroom where majority of time is required to tell you about the concepts. That has to happen online. Knowledge transfer happens online. But if you don't have some form of application-based practice, it's going to be hard for the behavior to actually be demonstrated for proficiency and any proof that somebody's there. And I know you still want that. I think it's just going to be the dynamics going to change when they're in an application setting. So now I think what can happen is managers who've been asked to do a lot can now, maybe their role is simplified because the knowledge is transferred electronically, and now a manager can simply run a few exercises. They don't have to be the trainer. They don't have to be completely up to speed on the knowledge and concepts. They need to know how to run good exercises and know what to look for as a coach. The future of virtual online classroom settings where your trainers or instructors now also have to transfer from being trainers and instructors that run people through a workbook to trainers and instructors that can facilitate a coaching, practicing, and feedback session. So I think it's still absolutely important. I think the timeline is going to shrink for it, but I think it's going to be super focused on practice and application.
Super, thank you for that. And you spoke about coaching. One of the questions that is, what is the role of coaching and mentoring to drive behavioral change?
So we've got evidence from all of our years as a training company that, this is the sad evidence, that on average, only 23% of managers coach skills to any high degree. And so that means that, my math isn't great, but 77% of managers, if left to their own devices, do not train skills to any degree. And yet we know that those who receive high coaching have significantly high adoption levels. They will adopt the skills that you teach in double digits, 10, 15, 17% more adoption of skills if they have a manager who coaches to those skills and expects those things to be practiced. So, one, we know managers improve adoption. Two, we know the majority of managers don't do it. So as a result, you have to figure out how to make that happen. One is consider the idea of what some of the ideas we shared here. Provide the virtual content in the moment where coaching might take place. If you're in stage one of a sales cycle, here's your content. It almost becomes a virtual coach. You learn what you need to learn in that moment, like your manager might do for you. So when your manager's not reliable, at least there's some content that they can get their hands on. But the other idea is that it will be simpler for managers. I picture what we're working on are what we call coaching kits. If you imagine when you went to school, in elementary school, and you had a substitute teacher when your teacher was ill, the ideal was the teacher was given a simple, let's say, DVD, and they would play a video, then ask a few questions, and run a class exercise. Anybody could be a substitute teacher because they could push the button to run the video, and they could ask the questions and run the exercise. We're trying to simplify coaching so that it isn't so dependent on the manager that actually they could run a simple in-service meeting with their team, play some of these videos, and be given a cheat sheet, if you will, to run certain exercises that we know create certain outcomes. So we're trying to simplify the role of the coach. Virtual content will help do that because that will provide the knowledge transfer, and then the coach is really just asked to run a set of Q&A and exercises around that, thereby actually giving them something to fill their agenda with when they have their team, but making it lighter on them in terms of what they have to know before they can do it. Nothing's going to be perfect. Even as we've tested coaching kits, we've started to see the percentage of coaching go from 23% to give or take 37%. So that's a huge increase. We can almost double the percentage of managers coaching, but going from 23 to 37%, while that's almost doubling, that's still a minority of managers. So it is an ongoing problem, and I don't have a surefire method for fixing that, other than maybe some of these ideas where the coaching happens when they need it and at the time they need it, right? When their manager might not be available. That's one thing we have to consider looking at is, if you will, a surrogate or virtual coaching model when your managers are not reliable or unavailable.
Super, thanks, Tim. And a final question here, which just goes back to the sort of in-person versus the virtual. Can you do role play and practice from remote locations, and can it be as effective as if you were doing it in the same classroom?
So what we've been doing is setting up online classrooms using any of a number of web platforms, and the premise is that the facilitator trainer gives some instruction to maybe a group of 10 people. Those 10 people take some time to work on some things, and then they come back using their cameras and they present. Often the request is that maybe you have a piece of paper or flip chart and some markers in your home office or wherever you are, or you're at least on camera delivering. So using sort of a telepresence, but anymore, everybody's got a camera in their laptop, and every company's got these web platforms, and most of these web platforms have the ability to section people off into even classroom sections where, like, you can take 4 people who are remote and move them into a practice session together where they only talk to each other and themselves, and bring them back to the main room. So the technology is there. It's something that facilitators have to get used to. But you can only sustain that for periods of time. So what we've done is taken, let's say, a half-day application session and broken it up to 2-hour web sessions, like a week apart, as a replacement for that. It's there, it's happening. That's where people are going with this, and so I think it's something companies are going to have to look into seriously getting comfortable with.
Great, thank you very much for that. So that was the last of the questions that we've had online. So all that leaves to be said is thank you very much, Tim. Fantastic presentation this afternoon. Thank you to everyone for joining. As I mentioned, the recording will be sent out 48 hours or so after on the email address you registered with. So thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone.